Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to England. George Henry Lamson was born on the 8th of September 1852 into a world of status and expectation. His father, William Orne Lamson, was a respected clergyman ministering to an American expatriate community in Florence in Italy. His mother, Julia Wood Schuyler, came from distinguished American lineage. Her father, Robert Schuyler, had been a prominent figure in New York finance and railroads, and her grandfather was none other than Philip Jeremiah Schuyler, brother to Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton and brother-in-law to Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of the United States. From such ancestry came high hopes. A teacher once remarked that the Lamson family would live long in the name of man, and George had a gift for languages, mastering French and German with ease, and had an almost magnetic ability to make friends. His early life was steeped in idealism and ambition. He joined the French Ambulance Corps during the Franco-Prussian War, tending to the wounded during the 1871 siege of Paris. His bravery earned him the Legion of Honor. Later, he worked as a volunteer surgeon in Romania and Serbia, and again distinguished himself. But the horrors of battlefield medicine left a different kind of mark on George, as he became reliant on morphine, an addiction that would shadow him for the rest of his life. Upon returning to England in 1878, George appeared poised to lead a stable and respectable existence. He married Kate John, the daughter of a once comfortable family. She was one of 5 siblings, 3 brothers and a sister, although by the time of her marriage, 1 brother and both her parents had already died. The family estate was held in trust, with each child's share becoming accessible upon marriage or reaching adulthood. As the law then stood, this being before the Married Woman's Property Act of 1882, Kate's inheritance passed directly into her husband's control following her marriage. With these funds, George set out to establish himself as a physician in Bournemouth, a fashionable and thriving seaside town. For a man who had earned honours on foreign battlefields and been decorated for service in Romania, Serbia and during the siege of Paris, it seemed the natural next step in a promising career. But beneath the facade lay a more troubling reality. With access to the inheritance, George soon started to overspend. He rented a fine property and invested in his medical practice before it even had any patients. From the very beginning, his practice faltered. He struggled to build a patient base in Bournemouth, as although he was qualified, he was relatively unknown, and with established practitioners already in place, many locals remained reluctant to consult him. But this did not stop George living beyond his means. He wanted to portray himself as a gentleman doctor, respectable and successful, though in reality this was not the case. Making matters worse was his addiction to morphine. What had once numbed physical and emotional pain in battlefield hospitals had now become a daily dependency. It had affected both his mind and his finances. As his debts mounted, creditors grew increasingly impatient. Checks bounced, the bank shut its doors, and his wife's money, what remained of it, was vanishing fast. Then in 1879, Kate's brother, Herbert John, died unexpectedly. Unmarried, and with no children or surviving parents, his share of the estate was divided among the remaining siblings, which were Kate's, her sister Mrs. Chapman, and Kate's younger brother Percy. But what this meant for George was that his very poor financial situation, at least for a time, would be alleviated. However, this was only a short reprieve. By the start of 1881, he was once again in dire financial straits. He had been in trouble with the local medical society after it was discovered that he had falsely claimed academic qualifications to which he had no rights. Bailiffs had descended upon his home, seizing what little value remained. Legal writs followed him from address to address. No longer a respected physician, he had become a man teetering on the edge of ruin, though outwardly he still clung to the appearance of professional respectability. That spring, he crossed the Atlantic under the guise of seeking opportunity in America. In truth, he was escaping the collapse of his finances. He was now a man growing more desperate by the day, and only managed to pay his passage by taking temporary work as a ship's surgeon. He did borrow small sums from his acquaintances, but always under false assurances that he was unable to fulfill. By the time he returned to London, in the autumn of 1881, there was little trace of the man he had once been. The decorated war surgeon and ambitious young doctor had vanished. In his place stood someone gaunt, anxious, with mounting debts, and driven by addiction. George also had a creeping sense that both time and luck were running out. George's wife had a brother named Percy Malcolm John, who was nearing his 19th birthday. He lived at a school in Wimbledon as a ward of Chancery, under the supervision of the headmaster, Mr. Bedbrook. Percy was no ordinary boy. His spine was curved from a childhood illness, and he was paralysed from the waist down. He required constant assistance, and used a wheelchair to navigate the halls of the school. Despite this, he was cheerful, intelligent, and eager to participate in school life. Percy was also an heir. The John family estate had been divided, so each child would inherit their share upon reaching adulthood or marrying. Percy, unmarried and still underage, was the last beneficiary of the trust. If he died before December the 18th, 1881, his £3,000 share would revert to his two sisters, one of whom was George's wife. On the 24th of November 1881, George's behaviour seemed to take a darker turn. He pawned his watch and medical instruments for a mere £5, and the next day he attempted to pass a forged cheque at the American Exchange in the Strand. He also borrowed £20 from a man who lived on the Isle of Wight, although the terms of this loan were quite questionable. Over the next few days, he wrote two letters, one to a friend, in which he blamed a bank mistake for a cheque that he had sent to him not being honoured. The second was to his wife's brother, Percy. George wrote just a few lines to him, which read, "I leave for Florence tomorrow, stopping off for a few days in Paris, so I propose to run down for a few minutes before I go. Believe me, my dear boy, your loving brother, G.H.L." George arrived at the school on the 3rd of December 1881, with a cake and a box of capsules. He was dressed neatly, but not overly so. His clothes looked presentable, though somewhat unremarkable. His appearance, however, suggested fatigue. His face was pale, and his eyes seemed tired, as if weighed down by the troubles that he had been facing. When he entered the study where Mr. Percy John sat, the boy greeted him warmly. George, trying to mask his weariness, remarked on how well Percy looked, to which the young man responded, "I wish I could say the same of you." Mr. Bedbrook, the headmaster, was also present, and he offered George a drink of sherry, which he accepted on the condition that it may be sweetened with sugar. A basin of caster sugar was brought in, and George happily put some into his glass. He then got out his Dundee cake, which somewhat strangely he had already sliced. He handed pieces to Percy and Mr. Bedbrook, and the three men started eating it. A few moments later, he took out a capsule from his little black bag and told the headmaster that he had brought them from America and that he would find them useful for giving medicine to the boys. He seemed quite excited, and filling one capsule with what looked like sugar, he handed it to Percy and said, "You're a champion pill taker. Show Mr. Bedbrook how easy it is." Percy smiled and swallowed the contents of the capsule. George then exchanged a few more pleasantries before excusing himself, as he announced that he had to catch a train to the coast, as he was travelling to Paris. As Mr. Bedbrook walked him out, George turned to him and said, "I don't think Percy will last much longer," a remark that Mr. Bedbrook found quite unsettling and strangely out of place, especially given Percy's generally stable condition. Soon after, however, Percy started to complain of heartburn, then nausea, then wrenching pain. Gasping for breath, he whispered that he felt the same as he did after his brother-in-law had given him a pill when they went on holiday to Shanklin. The matron, a woman named Mrs. Godward, attended him, but the young man was not getting any better. Now very concerned, Mr. Bedbrook sent for Dr. Little to assist, but despite his efforts, not much could be done. Percy's muscles clenched uncontrollably, and his breathing started to fail. At 11 p.m. the same evening, Saturday the 3rd of December 1881, 19-year-old Percy Malcolm John died. The headmaster had witnessed the tragic scene unfold, and now could only stand in stunned silence. Before Mr. George Lamson's visit, Percy had not shown any signs of illness. Only hours earlier the young man had seemed perfectly well. The suddenness of it all had left Mr. Bedbrook and others in shock as they struggled to comprehend the swift and brutal turn of events. Suspicion soon arose that Percy may have been poisoned, which prompted those present to carefully collect his vomit for analysis. They hoped that it may help uncover the cause of his sudden and severe illness. The police were called, and on Sunday the 4th of December, Inspector Fuller arrived to examine the scene. During his search, he discovered a box containing capsules and 5 small white pills. He carefully secured these items, along with crystallized fruits, pieces of cake, sugar, and several white powders that were found among the deceased's belongings. Another box caught his attention. It was labelled quinine, and inside he counted 20 unopened packets. As he continued, Inspector Fuller came across a half-eaten Dundee cake, 2 additional pills wrapped in tinfoil, and a decanter of sherry. All of these items were gathered and later handed to Superintendent Digby, who instructed an officer to deliver them to Scotland Yard. There, Chief Superintendent Williamson sent the evidence on to 2 toxicologists, Dr. Dupre and Dr. Stevenson. The contents, including the food, powders, and the vomits, were all tested for poison. On Tuesday, the 6th of December, Dr. Berry, Dr. Bond, and Dr. Little carried out a post-mortem examination on Percy Malcolm John. Apart from paralysis of his lower limbs due to spinal curvature, Percy had been a well-developed, muscular young man. His brain showed slight congestion, and his pupils were dilated. His lungs were mostly healthy, but congested in the lower regions, and there were old adhesions at the apex of his right lung. The heart, though healthy, was almost entirely empty and flaccid. The liver, kidneys, and spleen were all intensely congested, while the mucous lining of the stomach was inflamed. Notably, several small yellow-grey patches were discovered near the larger end of the stomach, which were signs consistent with recent irritation, and parts of the small intestine were similarly affected. Samples of stomach contents, organs, and body fluids were collected and handed to Dr. Bond. In the doctor's judgment, there was no evidence of natural disease sufficient to explain Percy's death. Based on all the findings, it was concluded that his demise was most likely caused by an irritant vegetable poison, specifically one consistent with aconitum, a powerful and rarely used alkaloid. By now, news of Mr. Percy John's sudden and unexplained death had reached the newspapers. The reports detailed how a seemingly healthy young man had died within hours of falling ill and shortly after receiving a visit from a relative. Mr. George Lamson, who was in Paris at the time, read about the death in the press. Upon learning of the incident and the police inquiry that had followed, he made a swift decision to return to London without delay. On the 8th of December, he walked into Scotland Yard and with measured composure he announced, "I am Dr. Lamson. I read the account in the public papers in Paris and came over this morning. I am very unwell and upset about this matter." He offered to leave his address, perhaps believing that his voluntary appearance and his apparent openness would be enough to divert any suspicion. However, officers at Scotland Yard were not swayed by his calm demeanour or claims of distress. They had already begun piecing together a troubling picture of events leading up to the young man's death, and Dr. Lamson's sudden reappearance only deepened their concern. Officers arrested him, and he was formally charged with murder. The press had followed the case with fascination from the outset. The sudden death of a charming young man, the suggestion of poison, and the involvement of a well-spoken doctor with transatlantic connections gave the story all the hallmarks of a sensational tragedy. Newspapers across Britain, and even abroad, reported on every new development, fueling public interest and speculation. The trial of George Henry Lamson eventually began at the Old Bailey on the 8th of March 1882 and was presided over by Justice Hawkins. The prosecution outlined the evidence, suggesting that Mr. Lamson's motive was greed and the chance of an additional inheritance. It was said that the defendant had laced a Dundee cake with aconitum, a potent and deadly poison that he had first learned about during his medical studies at Edinburgh University. The prosecution claimed that it was discussed by the esteemed Professor Robert Christiansen, and that at the time the professor had indicated that aconitum was virtually impossible to detect making it a very interesting poison for anyone with malicious intent. The prosecution told the courts that since Dr. Lamson's student days, forensic science had advanced significantly, so now what would have once gone unnoticed could be uncovered by more advanced forensic methods. Many witnesses were called over the course of the proceedings, painting a picture of the defendant as a man whose financial position had steadily worsened and who had grown increasingly desperate. Doctors, chemists, bankers, and acquaintances all gave testimony, building a detailed account of Mr. Lamson's recent conduct, his character, and his possible intent. Experts in toxicology explained how the poison had acted on the body, while others described the symptoms observed in the final hours of Mr. Percy John's life. Together, these accounts helped to establish motive, means, and opportunity. One key witness was Mr. William Ralph Dodd, an assistant at Allen and Hanbury's chemists in Lombard Street in London. Mr. Dodd recounted that on or about the 24th of November, Mr. Lamson had entered the shop and requested 2 grains of aconitum. He said that the gentleman wrote his name, G.H. Lamson, medical doctor, Bournemouth, Hampshire. Mr. Dodd added that he verified this by consulting the medical directory. He went on to say that he followed the standard procedure and asked his colleague, Mr. Betts, to assist with weighing the poison. Mr. Dodd also said that Mr. Lamson had requested that the aconitum be wrapped and clearly labelled as a poison, with the chemist's name included. He went on to say that after reading the report in the Evening Echo on the 5th of December about Mr. Percy John's death, he remembered selling the poison. The defence counsel asked him why he had not written the sale in the poison register, to which Mr. Dodd replied that no entry had been made this time, as it was not needed when sold to a verified medical professional. He added that verification of Mr. Lamson's credentials was completed by consulting the medical directory. Further evidence came from Mr. William Stevenson, who had met the defendant in 1879. Mr. Stevenson testified that by late 1880 Mr. Lamson had been experiencing financial difficulties and had to vacate his property in 1881. Mr. Stevenson said that he had introduced him to Mr. McEwen Brown, who bought his furniture and helped settle his debts. Mr. Stevenson stated that Mr. Lamson still owed him over £100 when he left for America, and said that he thought that he would never see him again. But in October 1881, he received a letter from Mr. Lamson saying that he would be able to pay him his money, but needed his surgical instruments, a travelling rug, and £5, which Mr. Stevenson told the court he provided. When Mr. Stevenson was asked if he did hear from the gentleman again, he replied that he did not, and he later discovered that the instruments and the rug had ended up at a London pawnbroker. Mr. Edward Weiss Rebeck, the estate agent for the property that Mr. Lamson had lived, confirmed that the doctor had paid rent up until Christmas 1880, but had failed to pay after that date. He added that despite the sale of the gentleman's furniture, he still had substantial debts outstanding with the property owner. Another witness was Mr. Mayrick Heath, a cashier at the Wilts and Dorset Banking Company. He testified that Dr. Lamson had opened an account with the bank in November 1880, but it had to be closed in January 1881 due to a negative balance. Mr. Heath said that he sent Mr. Lamson a letter on the 20th of January 1881, notifying him that no further cheques would be honoured until the account was brought into a positive position. Mr. Heath said that he received no reply to the letter. The trial ended on the 14th of March, when the judge summed up the case. He told the jury that this was not a case involving complicated legal questions that might confuse them. The jury had to ask themselves 2 things. Did the boy die from the effects of poison? And if so, was it the prisoner who gave it to him? If they believed that Mr. Lamson had indeed given the poison, then it would be impossible to argue that it wasn't a clear case of deliberate murder. The judge urged the jury to look into all the facts honestly and carefully and make their decision based on the evidence alone. If they believed the prosecution had not proven the charge, as a matter of fairness and justice, they must find the defendant not guilty. He advised them sincerely to put aside any sympathy they might feel for the young man who had died in such a sad and tragic way. But equally, they must also set aside any sympathy for Mr. Lamson or for his family and loved ones that he could leave behind. Their duty was a solemn one. They owed it to their consciences and to justice to decide only what they believed was the truth. The jury deliberated for just 35 minutes before returning to announce that they found the defendants guilty of the murder of Percy Malcolm John. The judge then sentenced Dr. George Henry Lamson to death. However, following the guilty verdict, Mr. Lamson's defence counsel, led by Mr. Montague Williams, made a final appeal for clemency on the grounds of insanity. He argued that his client's long-standing addiction to morphine, combined with a possible hereditary predisposition of mental illness, had clouded his judgment and contributed to the crime. As Mr. Lamson was an American citizen, the case had attracted international attention. In a rare diplomatic intervention, the President of the United States, Mr. Chester Arthur, formally requested a delay in the execution to allow time for evidence of mental illness within Mr. Lamson's family to be submitted. The British authorities granted the extension, and supporting documents were sent to try and get the sentence commuted. However, once these materials were reviewed by the Home Office, they were found to be insufficient to justify a reprieve. No compelling medical basis could be established to override the court's verdict. On the morning of the 28th of April 1882, Mr. George Henry Lamson was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.